We are in Africa, a continent that remembers secrets older than the pyramids. The ancients knew things that we can only guess about, so they hid their knowledge wherever they could, under the scorching sand, in rope knots, even in the eternal ice of Antarctica. They were already building 5-story buildings and left a waterfall painted bloody red. Want to see what exactly they were trying to hide? Watch this video to the end, you'll like it. Hi friend, you're on the KirTop channel. Gas mummy. When gas company workers dug a narrow trench just half a meter deep in the middle of the bustling Puente Piedra neighborhood, they were more likely to stumble upon another rock fragment than a window into a 1,000-year-old abyss. Instead of the usual sand, the shovel hit the dark trunk of a dried-up huarango tree. Ancient Peruvians placed such beacon trees only on graves. Inside, archaeologists saw a dark cocoon of reed fabric. A teenager of about 15 years old was sitting with his legs tucked up, as if waiting for a ritual that did take place, but with a delay of a whole millennium. The Chankay masters, who lived between the 11th and 13th centuries, knew the secrets of natural mummification. Dry air, a cotton shroud, and a little salt from the ocean breeze that still permeates today's Lima smoke. You stand in the middle of a metropolis with 10 million inhabitants and understand that there are hundreds of such invisible neighbors lying under your feet. Smile of an Indian. It looks like someone scratched a funny face on a school desk, but before us is a North American petroglyph from the 11th to 17th centuries, part of the lion complex of 37 figures. The stone is painted with paw prints, people, and animals. This particular character stands out with its horns, feathers, and outstretched palms. Scientists argue about what it means. A shaman in a ritual headdress, a totem spirit, or simply an author's self-portrait with a sense of humor. Mostly serious scenes of hunting and cosmogony have survived to this day, but here we have an almost cartoonish grimace. This means that the artist had room for irony and self-expression, and not just for sacred subjects. Giant Caliga. The ditches along the Roman fort of Magna have long been known for their surprises, but the May find surpassed all. From the anaerobic sludge of the ankle-breaking ditch, archaeologists raised a perfectly preserved leather boot with intact layered soles, lacing straps, and almost all of the hobnails. The length is 32 centimeters, which makes it a British size 12 to 14 and a European size 47 to 48. For comparison, the average legionary Caliga barely reached today's size 41. The giant was not a figment of the imagination. A second, slightly smaller pair was dug up in the same layer, dated to the 2nd century AD. Everything was at the bottom of an ankle breaker, a clever trap where an attacker would put his foot, fall into a hole, and leave the ankle to the Roman cavalry. The swamp water cut off the oxygen, so the leather, wooden fastener, and metal spikes have reached us almost intact. Scientists are trying to figure out whether the owner was an elite bodyguard recruited from the barbarian giants or just a rare giant centurion. Ritual rice. In the northern Retidian cave, archaeologists found imprints of rice husks on pottery that are at least 3,500 years old. The only traces are a thin film of starch and phytoliths, but this is enough to confirm that the settlers reached Guam, carrying rice across 2,300 kilometers of open ocean. No fields, terraces, or sickles were ever found, meaning the grains were saved not for lunch, but for ritual. Perhaps once a year to remind the spirits of their ancestors of their distant home in Taiwan. In the hands of the islanders, rice turned from an everyday food into a symbol of origin, and that is why tiny marks on the dishes turned out to be more important than a whole cemetery of bone harpoons. They replaced the alphabet. A quipu is a bundle of knotted ropes, the main thread from which dozens of colored cords hang. For a long time, it was believed that the Incas simply counted corn and taxes with knots, as if they were ancient abacuses. A team of linguists and programmers loaded 21 whole quipus from a museum in Peru into a neural network. The algorithm looked at what color the rope was, at what distance from the main line it hung, what kind of knots were tied, and in what order. The machine quickly found repeating combinations, like identical words in a long text. It turned out that the same set of knots on a yellow rope is found next to records of grain pantries, and another on a red one is bundled with lists of warriors. Scientists compared this with colonial Spanish documents and realized that the quipus conveyed a meaning much richer than a simple count. For example, the combination of green rope plus 3 short knots almost always marks a place where corn is stored, while red plus double knot may mean a tax for the army. If the method is confirmed on a larger number of samples, the quipu will cease to be a knot calculator and will be recognized as a real writing system. Then the Incas will have to be rewritten from the list of civilizations without letters to the list of peoples who simply chose a different alphabet, the rope alphabet. Boar helmet. On the hills near Pylos, just a few meters from Nestor's palace, archaeologists have uncovered a find that could previously only be seen on the pages of the Iliad. The 15th century BC burial contained dozens of thin, skillfully drilled plates made from wild boar tusks. When they were laid out in their places of attachment, a full battle helmet emerged, the very one that Homer describes in the scene where Meriones hands over the armor to Odysseus. Each plate covered the skull like a scale. The lining was leather, reinforced with bronze rivets. To assemble such a helmet, about 50 tusks were needed. That is, a whole hunt and a serious warrior status. Nearby, a bronze lyre peg and remains of myrrh oil were found, symbols of the elite and war at the same time. Radiocarbon dating gives a date of about 1500 BC. That is, the helmet is at least 3 centuries older than Homer's text. Confirmation of 2 things at once. The boar armor was not a literary touch, but the reality of the Mycenaean rulers and oral epics really did preserve details that archaeology is only now seeing. The Trojan War may remain a dispute among historians, but this helmet shows that its attributes once rang with real metal. Manoan grill. On display at the Museum of Prehistoric Thera is a seemingly ordinary barbecue grill, but it is over 3,000 years old. The stone blocks of the Manoans from Santorini look like a miniature relief of a fortress wall. Bull's heads on the sides, slots for skewers on top, and an even row of round holes at the bottom. Air blew through them on the coals, turning the portable structure into a real turbo barbecue of the Bronze Age. Imagine how in the port of Akrotiri sailors throw pieces of goat meat onto these stone frying pans, and the aroma of smoke wafts along the streets, which are now hidden by the ash of the eruption. Scientists have long argued about why the Minoans needed such mobility. A banquet on a ship, street trading, or a ritual feast when the sacrifice was divided right at the sanctuary. Whichever version wins, the technology works flawlessly. Air starts under the coals, passes through a line of holes, and heats the stone evenly. The same thing modern chefs do when they place a fan near the grill. Every time we bite into a hot piece of meat on the Aegean coast, we are repeating a recipe that the Minoans perfected long before the Trojan War. Bloody waterfall. Antarctica is a continent of records, and one of the strangest is the scarlet stream flowing from the Taylor Glacier. The ice layer here should be sterile, but the meltwater is colored a deep red. Until recently, scientists blamed iron. A rusty stream, everything is clear. However, an analysis in 2023 showed otherwise. Nanospheres were found in the water, tiny particles smaller than a virus with an iron core covered with calcium and aluminum. While they are under the ice, the color is invisible. As soon as the water breaks out, the shell instantly oxidizes and the stream turns into liquid blood. The source is an ancient salt lake, sealed millions of years ago. Salt lowers the freezing point and simultaneously releases heat during crystallization. Therefore, the water remains liquid even at -10 degrees Celsius. Bacteria live in a closed salt system, isolated since the time when modern ecosystems had not yet formed on Earth. They feed on sulfur compounds, doing without light and oxygen, a direct scenario for possible life under the ice of Europa or Enceladus. Bottom line, Blood Falls is not mysticism or algae. It is a demonstration of how chemistry, microbes, and geology can work together to create a completely alien picture on their home planet. Canadian runes. Northern Ontario rarely spoils us with big archaeological news, but the hurricane of 2018 brought a sensation. When the wind tore out a century-old pine tree near the town of Wawa, a granite slab with an area of almost 2 by 1.5 meters was found under its roots. The surface was polished by a glacier, and a neat frame was cut along the edges. Inside are 255 runes of the Elder Futhark, the full text of the Our Father. Not a single mistake. the same depth of cut as if the master wrote in a familiar alphabet. On the right is engraved a boat with 16 figures inside. Just below, 14 crosses, X, of unknown meaning. Radiocarbon does not help here, but geochemists have determined that the thinnest crust of oxides at the bottom of the cut was formed for about 200 years. This means that the monument dates back to the early 19th century, the era when Swedish and Norwegian settlers developed the area. Vikings. Number. The style of the runes is late, closer to the ethnographic monuments of Scandinavia, and the Christian prayer hints at a missionary context. Why the slab ended up in the middle of nowhere and face down is the main question. One version, a forest church of a temporary lumberjack camp where the stone served as an altar. Another is a memorial to the perished crew. 16 people in the boat and 14 crosses nearby could be account of the living and the dead after the crash on the Great Lakes. Whatever is hidden behind the mystery, the inscription became the longest runic prayer found in North America. Mycenaean gold. In 2004, archaeologists uncovered the intact dome tomb of Kazanaki near Volos, a rare chance to see Mycenaean luxury in its original form. 7 burials lay on the stone floor, and 165 gold objects were scattered between them. Tiny discs, tubes, relief beads, weapon parts. The thickness of many of the plates was fractions of a millimeter. Craftsmen hammered out 200 mini-solar circles from 10 grams of metal and sewed them to the fabric, turning the shroud into a reflective armor. The jewelry has one feature: absolute fragility. The gold is minimally alloyed with copper so as not to lose its shine, and the edges are deliberately not reinforced. Such an outfit was not worn during life. It was created for one occasion: the funeral ceremony. Intricate items, rings, dagger handles, demonstrate the opposite approach. There, gold is just a thin shell. The base was made of bronze or a wooden core. Foil was applied on top, and the joints were masked with granulation and cloisonné enamel. In this way, luxury is preserved visually, and the metal is physically saved. This find revealed one of the main rules of the Late Bronze Age. Gold was not just currency, but a scenography of power. The thinner the sheet, the louder the visual effect and the more obvious the message to descendants. Our family could afford to shine, even if there were not really resources for this. The Fiskum Battle Axe. At first glance, it looks like a black obsidian boomerang, but this is an elite battle axe from the late Neolithic era. A fisherman from the Norwegian Lake Fiskum pulled it out with a net back in the 1780s. He weighed it, exactly 700 grams of dense basalt, smooth as polished marble. The dating of 2850 to 2350 BC refers the artifact to the battle axe culture. The perfect symmetry is striking. The blade is elongated like the keel of a boat. The hole for the handle is drilled on both sides with stone tubular drills, an operation that took days. Why so much work? Such axes are almost never found with knocked-out edges. This means that they were rarely used as weapons. Rather, it was a status symbol. You hold it in your hand and everyone sees that you have a rare material and the skill of distant artisans. Polishing to a mirror shine is a separate story. Basalt was ground with quartz sand until it had a glossy finish. Thus, the axe turned into a black mirror, which, according to one version, was used in rituals. The sun, reflecting, illuminated the owner's face, emphasizing his connection with the heavens. Today, the Fiskum axe is kept in the Museum of Cultural History in Oslo. Under glass, it looks almost like a modern design object, but it is worth remembering. This blade is 5,000 years old. Venus of Parsenta. In December 2022, a Polish farmer near Kołobrzeg dug up a 12-centimeter figurine of a woman with accentuated hips and a narrow waist from a field. 3 years of lab work and the dating is ready. About 6,000 years old, the early Neolithic era. An electron microscope scan showed traces of a flint cutter, and the clay spectrum matched the floodplain of the Parsenta River, meaning the figurine was made by local farmers and not brought in by traders. Why it's important? Northern Poland has long been considered the periphery of the Venus culture. Classical, Paleolithic, and Neolithic goddesses were found in southern Europe. Now the Baltic gets its own Mother Earth and moves the border of the fertile cult zone hundreds of kilometers to the north. Garnet Raven. In a field in Cornwall, a couple of amateur metal detectorists came across a signal of pure gold. First, a flat piece with triangular garnet inserts surfaced. It seemed to be an ordinary Anglo-Saxon ring from the 7th century until an even rarer thing appeared a few steps away from the first find. A figurine of a raven's head weighing 57 grams. On the beak there are neat cutouts. Nostrils on the sides, cells for inserts. The left eye still shines with garnet. The right, alas, is lost. Analysis showed the gold is almost pure, with a micro addition of silver and copper for strength. The master divided the surface into feathers with 100 micrograined balls and tightly planted garnet triangles between them. The style coincides with the famous Sutton Hoo, but the technique is more filigree, the result of a later royal workshop of East Anglia. The purpose is mysterious. The object is too heavy to be an earring and too short to be a fibula. Scientist's version: a detail of a ceremonial standard or the handle of a ritual staff that was carried onto the battlefield on the day of the king's naming. The raven symbolism here is not accidental. The bird is directly associated with Odin, the god of war and wisdom, whose 2 ravens brought news from the battlefield. The finds are currently undergoing the treasure procedure at the British Museum. If the expert commission confirms the dating and uniqueness, the object will officially be included in the list of the most important Anglo-Saxon jewelry items. Treasures of the Alans. The southern outskirts of the Chechen village of Alcancala have long been listed in the Archaeological Register, but excavations in 2025 sharply increased interest. At the bottom of a narrow, carefully stone-lined tomb, a pendant sparkled. A thin gold ring with 5-faceted almandine inserts. A glass bowl the color of a melting glacier lay slightly to the right. The chemical composition confirmed its Byzantine or Persian origin. Bronze cheek pieces were found among the horse bones, and along the warrior's legs, a scabbard with stylized griffins, typical of Sassanid art. The burial dates back to the end of the 9th century, a time when Alania controlled the passes between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. The richness of the inventory suggests that before us is a person from the top of society, possibly a representative of the rulers of Dariel. But the jeweler's technique indicates that the pendant was made locally. The gold contains a characteristic admixture of platinum from Caspian placers, and the grain sits on a glue composition known from Khazar finds. Taken together, the tomb destroys the old image of nomad intermediaries. Alanian society at the end of the first millennium looked more complex. Its own jewelers, long-distance glass trade, close ties with Iran and Byzantium, and most importantly, the desire to perpetuate status in gold and horse harness. Gears of mystery. The most ancient computer on the planet, the Antikythera mechanism, always seemed like something from an Indiana Jones movie. Bronze wheels, a handle, dials, eclipses, all of the antique NASA in a box. But a recent 3D simulation literally broke the legend down to its teeth. Scientists recreated each gear with an accuracy of microns and launched the virtual device for a full calendar cycle. The result was shocking. After 4 months of continuous work, the teeth began to cling, the load increased, and by the 6th month, the digital copy simply jammed. The error is not in the software. The model takes into account all the casting defects, the pitch of the teeth and the play of the axles measured on the real artifact. If the numbers are correct, the mechanism in its original form could not reliably predict eclipses for years in advance as enthusiasts claimed. The tabletop planetarium toy version suddenly looks more plausible. The owner turned the handle, demonstrated the movements of the sun and the moon, enough for the wow effect of the elite public, but not for the daily calculations of a priest astronomer. There is another option. The bronze lay underwater for 2,000 years, corrosion ate away fractions of a millimeter and knocked down the ideal synchronization. If so, the original device really worked without failures, and we see only its rusty screenshot. To test the hypothesis, engineers will have to make a copy with perfectly even teeth and start the chrono marathon again. While the debate rages, there is only one conclusion. The Antikythera mechanism remains a puzzle on the level of the Rubik's Cube, only antiquity added mysticism. Either we underestimate ancient engineers, or we overestimate our own desire to see super technology in every riddle. Siberian Blacksmith. The Krasnoyarsk excavation of Pinchug 6 initially looked like another standard Xiongnu burial mound field. Everything changed when a buckle with a carefully welded loop was removed from the burial lens. A metallographic examination showed that the connection was made by real welding. For the 3rd century AD, this is a technological gap. Nearby lay miniature hammers, knife blanks, and a charred half of a forge, all in one grave, and the remains were cremated along with the tools, a classic funeral rite for a master who, according to beliefs, would need a forge in the afterlife. For Siberia of that time, such welds were never recorded. The composition of the weld, iron plus phosphorus, coincides with the practice of the Xiongnu steppe blacksmiths, but the method itself is clearly from somewhere further south. This means that the equipment arrived in transit through the Altai to Yenisei trade corridor, got stuck in an isolated settlement, and was mothballed. Egyptian towers. When you hear the words ancient Egyptian houses, most people picture squat mud brick huts. Excavations in Emet, northern Delta, change the picture radically. Archaeologists have uncovered a late-period block, a whole street of tower houses, 4 to 5 stories high, a solid wall along the processional road to the Wajet Temple. The height is estimated at 12 to 15 meters, which for the 7th century BC is the equivalent of a modern 5-story block. The lower levels are filled with grain silos and beer vats. Higher up are living rooms with narrow chimneys, and even higher are covered terraces where date pits and bronze sistrums of the goddess Hathor have been preserved. In the evening, they didn't just dine here, but held rituals with music. 5 steps from the doors, a limestone promenade stretches to the Wajet Temple. The slabs are polished so that even today they reflect the setting sun, and the cult columns stand exactly where the masters of the 7th century BC placed them. It turns out to be a real mini-Memphis in the provinces. Dense, high-rise buildings, a market, a temple, and a sacred road in one cramped block. 3 layers of repair in the masonry show that the towers lived for at least a century and a half, and reliefs with Harpocrates and green faience Ushabtis are still visible on the facades, a sign that religion and everyday life here literally shared one wall. It destroys the old stereotype of a one-story Egypt. Tutankhamun's ship. Inside the KV-62 tomb, among the golden masks and thrones, stood an object that Egyptologists immediately dubbed a yacht for eternity. Before you is an alabaster ship box, slightly longer than a palm. The hull is curved like a lunar crescent. The bow and stern are the heads of mountain goats with inlaid horns. On the deck is a tiny temple with papyrus columns and a mini sanctuary, where, according to belief, the Ka of the young pharaoh rested. The material is Egyptian calcite alabaster, transparent like melted honey. Under the beam of a flashlight, the light passes through, and the entire structure seems to be illuminated from within. The parts are fastened with pins, and the thin lines of the drawing are laid with resin and pigment, so that even in the pitch darkness of the tomb, the pattern does not fade. On the sides are the cartouches of Tutankhamun, guarded by the symbols of Anubis and Horus. Why do you need such a luxurious boat? The Egyptians believed that after death, the pharaoh boards the boat of the sun and sails through the dark waters of the underworld to rise again in the east with Ra. The alabaster model is a pocket copy of this boat, a kind of ticket to the afterlife cruise. The stone is durable. The box has survived 3,000 years, sand and robbers' attempts, almost without tarnishing. In the Cairo Museum, it still looks like a toy liner, ready to set off into eternity. Scarab Substitution. Remember the golden heart scarab from the tomb of Hatnefer? For many years, museum plaques claimed that the amulet was carved specifically for this noble Egyptian. A recent scan with microluminescent backlight turned everything upside down. Right under the engraved name of Hatnefer, erased text appeared. The first inscription was literally scraped off to rewrite the owner. It turns out that the beetle lived at least 2 lives. Its green serpentine shell once belonged to another person, and the priests simply reset the past, applied fresh hieroglyphs, and put the talisman in the chest of the new owner. The amulet is not a trinket. It contains an encrypted passage from the Book of the Dead, where the heart is asked not to give false testimony against the owner in the court of Mot. If the name did not match the body, the ritual could fail, so the secondary engraving was done with jewelry precision. The depth of the stroke changes by only tenths of a millimeter. But the microscope records this difference too, as if the artifact itself whispers that the memory cannot be erased completely. The logic of repurposing is clear. The amulet is too expensive. High-quality serpentine, the chain is almost pure gold. In the era of the 18th dynasty, such things were not thrown away. They were sold or passed on by inheritance. But the main discovery is not saving, but the attitude to the sacred. For the ancient priests, the correct text was more important than the original registration of the object. Erase the name, write it again, and the beetle is again ready to guard the heart of its owner in the afterlife. So one scarab in the display case of the Metropolitan Museum suddenly turned from a static relic into a living document about how ancient Egypt knew how to rewrite biographies even for things. And how many more such artifacts are stored in all the museums of the world, whose history has at least 2 lives. The Taran Dress. At first glance, it's just a piece of faded linen, but radiocarbon dating immediately reveals a sensation. The piece is at least 5,000 years old, older than the Giza pyramids. It was found back in 1913 among a pile of burial textiles near the village of Taran, and only modern restoration revealed the details. Before us is not a burial dummy, but an item from a real wardrobe. A V-neck, thin pleats along the bodice, sleeves to the elbow. Along the armpit seams are dark stripes of salt and fat, and grains of Nile sand are hidden in the microcracks of the fibers. All these are signs of wear. The dress was worn until the very end and then placed in the tomb as favorite clothes, so that its owner would appear before the gods in something that emphasized her status during life. The linen itself is hand-woven, the threads twisted on the right side, the weave tight. The sleeves alone required thousands of carefully crafted stitches. The edges of the hem are carefully darned with a slightly different shade of thread. An ancient dressmaker was mending a dress, not wanting to part with an expensive job. This is a rare artifact that immerses us in the everyday life of the early Egyptians. We are used to seeing them in gold and stone, but this tunic shows a much more mundane luxury. The ability to create comfortable, beautiful clothes long before the invention of the Silk Road and trading machines. Matriarch Çatalhöyük looked like a chaotic hive of clay houses, but DNA analysis of 131 skeletons put everything in its place. Under the floors of neighboring houses, relatives were buried strictly along the maternal line: grandmother, mother, daughter. 1 burial or 2 neighboring rooms. Men were located without a clear pattern. It turns out that the center of social organization of this Neolithic city is women, and blood is transmitted along the female vertical. The gifts are especially eloquent. Tiny shell beads, lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan, miniature figurines of the mother goddess. All this is placed not for adults, but for baby girls. Funeral riches seem to advance the future role of the mistress of the house, while boys get a minimum of jewelry. Even the layout of the blocks hints at a female axis. The houses are grouped in clusters of 3 around fireplaces, where the walls are painted with hunting scenes, but the central place is occupied by female silhouettes with accentuated hips, a symbol of abundance. Çatalhöyük was often called egalitarian. They say that everyone has the same dwellings, which means equality. Genetics shows a nuance. Yes, there are almost no property classes, but the real power is family ties, and the maternal clan controls them. Surprise manuscript. Imagine, you open a medieval tome expecting dusty prayers, but get a full-fledged attraction. Some pages flash with huge initials. Others are covered with Taran signs, an ancient shorthand that only a couple dozen specialists on the entire planet can decipher today. There is a spread where the letters form figures of constellations, as if the author decided to combine a school primer with the night sky. You turn the page over, and in the corner you see a tiny scribble. The scribe checked his pen, quickly composing a mini potpourri of poems about birds. Half of the space is taken up by wide margins. Why waste expensive parchment? It turns out that the emptiness here is not emptiness. It was on these margins that medieval students filled in marginalia, and later the same margins saved books from mold. The humid air began to spoil the edges of the book, and the text remained on the side. There is also a completely unexpected format, a bat book. Such an almanac was worn hanging upside down from the belt, laid out at full height, and immediately received a calendar, tables of lunar phases, and a list of saints for the entire year. Purple spots in the corners? These are mold scars. The manuscript was once stored in dampness, and microbes managed to bite off the pages. Now scientists literally count the fungal growth rings like on an old tree. Just imagine how much information is hidden in these cosmetic defects. They are used to date library moves and even change the idea of the climate of that era. It is these visual Easter eggs that make the manuscript not just a collection of text, but a full-fledged quest. Each mark, each unexpected tab is a direct portal to the people who wrote, read, and used this book centuries before us. The Pair of Anguish. Medieval interrogation rooms knew dozens of sophisticated instruments, but the Pair of Anguish remains a symbol of pure pain. On the outside is a smooth metal fruit with an elegant handle. Inside is a screw mechanism that spreads the petals. The executioner inserted the device into the victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina and slowly turned the screw. The steel flaps opened, tearing tissue and breaking the bones of the pelvis or jaw. The instrument did not kill instantly. Its purpose was to make someone talk or humiliate. For heretics and witches, the pair was often heated over coals so that the metal burned through from the inside. The wounds almost always ended in infection. Even if the person survived, gangrene did its job. Today, these fruits can be found in the dark display cases of European museums. The master's marks and serial numbers show that production was put on stream, as if torture were the same kind of craft industry as the making of locks or kitchen utensils. Royal Sapphire. This is a ring from the late 14th to early 15th century, the time when the throne of the English crown passed from Richard II to Henry V. The solid blue crystal was cut from a single piece of sapphire. The craftsman did not set the stone in a frame, but turned the stone itself into a monolithic ring. Such work required not only a rare gem, but also mastery of diamond powder, the only abrasive capable of grinding corundum. In the Middle Ages, sapphire was considered the stone of justice. Kings and bishops wore it when concluding contracts. They believed that the crystal would make the oath-breaker suffer from fever. On the cutting platform, you can see a tiny step. Here the jeweler ground the surface so that the cutter did not slip. The ring weighs less than 10 grams, but the price in the 15th century was equal to the cost of a good knight's armor. The object probably belonged to one of the high vassals of the court. Documents consider the sapphire to be part of the Norwich treasure, buried during the Lollard troubles and excavated 5 centuries later. Mona Lisa from the deep. In 2014, the Odyssey Marine team raised the wreck of the SS Central America from the bottom of the Atlantic, which sank in 1857 during the gold rush. Among the bars and coins on the silt lay a tiny daguerreotype, a portrait of a girl with dark curls and a calm half-smile. The glass of the frame was broken, but the silver plate survived. Salt water cut off the oxygen, and the image lay at a depth of 2,194 meters for more than a century and a half. Newspapers immediately dubbed it the Mona Lisa of the Abyss. The name of the model is unknown. On board that voyage were investors' miners, their wives, and a pack of New York bankers. The portrait could have been a wallet talisman for any of the passengers. Based on the fashion of the dress and brooch, restorers dated the photo to the early 1850s, meaning she was no more than 30 when the photo was put in the travel case. Today, the daguerreotype is exhibited together with the Central America gold. Interestingly, the chamber silver plate tells more about the tragedy than a ton of precious metal. Now it is the only portrait of almost 500 drowned stories. And this is only a small part of the secrets that the Earth has already begun to show. Like, subscribe, and see you at the next excavation, when we will find a forgotten history under another layer of sand. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Bye everyone.